Please help me welcome Christopher Preston.
Appreciate it. I guess I'm taller than I thought I was.
Yes.
Thanks for coming out. And thanks Mark, thanks Andrea, thanks Elk River Books for hosting me here. The best way I think to introduce this book is to say where I was at when I started writing it. Where I was at was I just finished that book, The Synthetic Age, that was just mentioned. And it was a technology book, and it's not about iPhones and EVs or whatever. It's about technologies like genetic editing, technologies like climate engineering, technologies that basically replace the world that we know and we love with a world that we have designed. And I was feeling pretty bleak about this, because it was starting to look like over the coming decades we were going to lose nature. We were going to lose the natural world. But bleak as it was, I couldn't help but noticing there were positive stories. There were still positive stories out there. And as I dug deeper in those positive stories, I realized there was another way to map out our future. A different way, a better way. And that's what this book is about. So I'm going to read the opening paragraph. Standing on the dock in the dead of Arctic winter, Sven Anders closed his eyes to the northern lights above. All the professor wanted to do right now was listen. As the mountains and green aurora faded from his retina, the sound of a gently rippling ocean washed over his body. Seconds after his mind quieted, he heard the splash of a large object, followed by a fierce exhalation of air. Then he heard another. Then another. A fishy scent wafted shoreward. Casting his head back to the sky, Sven Anders' mouth cracked open as he drank in the frigid nighttime air. He was perched on the doorstep of whales, dozens and dozens of whales, humpback and killer whales drawn to Norway's Kaldfjord in the winter months to feast on herring. So Kaldfjord is right where Norway kind of tips over and starts to become Russia. It's way the heck up there. And for a number of years, this fjord was just brimming with these humpback whales. You could look 360 degrees and all you would see would be whale spouts. I have a friend up there who has a house on the shore, and she said typically she would sleep every night of the year with her window open. But she said when the whales were there, she couldn't do that because she couldn't sleep. So these crazy Arctic Norwegians every night of the year with the windows open, I didn't get that part, but she couldn't sleep. There were so many whales. And so these whales, I introduce you to them first because they are a charismatic, prototypical tenacious beast. So you are a tenacious beast if your numbers have been reduced so much that extinction becomes a possibility, and then something changes, something kind of turns around, a law changes, an attitude changes, and you bounce back really strong. And humpback whales are a really good example of a tenacious beast. They're back to about 95% of their pre-whaling populations. In the Pacific Ocean, it's like the closest to where we are here, the population's up from about 1,200 to about 24,000. Up in Norway, where the book starts, the population has gone up from 1,000 to 26,000. In the Western Indian Ocean, it's gone up from 600 to 30,000. So these whales are doing incredibly well. So if whales are one tenacious beast, how many others are there out there? So I went looking, and I'm actually a philosopher, I'm not a biologist. And I didn't have a National Geographic travel budget, so I couldn't look very far. But what I found was a dozen, or it sort of depends how you count them, a dozen or so of these tenacious beasts. And so just a quick kind of speed through the ones that I discussed. I discussed wolves in Europe and red deer in Europe, also wild boar. And these I discussed, each section of beasts has a landscape. So these I discussed on farmland. Out here on the prairie, I discuss bison, I discuss pronghorn. Say a little bit about swift foxes as well, because there's been some success with swift foxes. So that's the prairie section. On rivers, I discuss beavers, and I discuss some salmon populations. So not all salmon have yet shown themselves to be tenacious beasts, but as dams come out, as they did in the Elwar, and they are on the Klamath right now, there's a possibility they will be tenacious beasts. In forests, on the left there, I went to Europe, and this is an Italian brown bear called a Marsican brown bear. And these brown bears are really showing their tenacity. They have been hovering so low for so long, and they're just starting to claw their way back. So the Marsican brown bear, and this is a barred owl, and the barred owl is kind of wrapped into a story of another tenacious beast, which I'll get to in a little bit. And then in oceans, we've got the humpback whales, which are kind of the star of that chapter. We've also got sperm whales, and we've got the cutest of all cute beasts, the sea otter. So this is a good news book, but we're in the middle of a biodiversity crisis, and so my biggest fear, actually, whenever I present this book to anybody, is that some biologist is going to stand up in the back and say, this is utterly misleading to talk about species doing well. We're in a crisis, climate change is going to make it worse, so you got to kind of get real. So I prepared some counter arguments here. What do I say to somebody who says we're in a crisis? What's up with this hope story that you're giving us? Well, hope's important. Hope is vital. If we're to make it through the biodiversity crisis, we have to be able to kind of see what's out there on the other side. So, I teach at the university, and for the first decade or so of my career, I thought my job was to persuade students how bad things were. Tell them about the climate crisis, tell them about the biodiversity crisis. They know that. They're not stupid, they know that. And what they actually need more than the bad news is they need a sense of what the good news looks like, a sense of what it feels like, so that they can plot a course towards that good news. So it's worth writing a book about hope for that reason. But there's other reasons too. I think talking about species and their tenacity and their ability to bounce back is more true to how biology actually works. So if you think of what happened when we got locked inside with COVID, we took a step back, and a lot of wildlife took a step forward. They came in and filled in those spaces. And you remember how delighted we were to hear about there were bears in Italian villages, there were dolphins in the Bosphorus and in Venetian canals, there were cougars in Santiago, Chile, there were wild boar everywhere. Creatures were just showing up. And creatures want to live. That's how biology works, right? Is you're looking to reproduce, you're looking to exploit a new niche. Biology works that way. Creatures want to live. So if you tell these good stories, it's a reminder of how biology works. And then the other thing I got to, and this was as the book was progressing, as it was forming, and as I was writing, being a philosopher, I thought, well, look, a lot of these animals have been away, sometimes for a century or so. And so, in their absence, we're left with the stories that the people who killed them off told. So we're left with century-old stories that get passed on. But when those animals come back, we need stories from today. And we're in a better position to know these animals now. We have different science, different techniques and technologies. We have different ways of living alongside these animals. We have a different public with different attitudes towards wildlife. And so we need ideas of animals that fit our time, not 19th century ideas of animals or early 20th century ideas of animals. So I saw this as an opportunity to bring up to date the way we think about wildlife. So that's my sort of justification to the skeptic about the good news. So what did I find? Well, when you look at these animals, you see, in terms of conservation and how to go about bringing animals back, there's kind of a range of things you can do. And these whales that I've mentioned already, here's the thing you have to do with them for those whales to come back. Stop killing them. It sounds trite, But it was one of the most profound things I learned in the book, is sometimes all an animal needs to come back is that you stop killing it. And that's true with those humpback whales. It's true with beavers. It's true with wolves. It's true with bison. Incredibly successful reproducers. And if you just stop killing them, they come back. And so that's on one extreme end here of the strategies. And again, I say this not as a wildlife biologist, but I say it as a philosopher. Hey, here's an idea. Let's allow the animals to live. Other times you need to do something more. And so this is an interesting slide for us in Montana, I think. This was taken in Italy. And these folks are pruning old apple trees. And has anyone got any idea why they're pruning these apple trees? Let me perhaps give you a little bit of a hint. They're in the Apennines, and the Apennines is home to this very rare bear that I was talking about, the Moskin bear.
Apple production.
For whom?
The bear.
For the bear. Yeah, they are pruning these apple trees for the bear. And this is really interesting for us in Montana, certainly in Missoula. When apple season happens, everyone is like, let's get these apples off these trees and let's get them inside somewhere because we don't want any black bears. Black bears are our problem in Missoula. We don't want black bears eating these apples. So keep the bears away from this type of food. In the Apennines in Italy, the strategy is to have bears eat apples. Why? Because these apple orchards are on the hillsides outside of the villages and outside the valley bottoms. And if they can keep the bears outside of the valley bottoms, those bears have a much better chance of surviving. There's been 50 of them for a century. So from 1910 or so, when the first parks were protected in the Apennines, there have been 50 of these bears for 100 years. The number has never grown above 50 because enough of them were getting killed, hit by cars, shot by people who saw them eating their chickens or raiding their beehives. They've stayed at 50 for a century. But by doing this kind of work, and by putting electric fences around the beehives, and by protecting chickens, and by educating people into best practices, these numbers have started to climb. So I was out there with a guy named Mario Cipollone, who works for Salviamo L'Orso, which is an organization protecting the Marsupial bear. And I said, all right, Mario, I'm going to go out on the road with this book. How many bears are there right now? And he said, you can feel comfortable telling people there's 70. He said, I think there's more. And he said, we're going to do a genetic test over the next year or so. And he said, I think we might find that there's quite a bit more than that. So that's still not a lot of bears, right? 70, 80, maybe 90 bears. But it's an increase of 40, 60, 80%, something like that. So these bears are starting to come back through this kind of work. Now, obviously I wanted to see a Moskin bear when I was out there. I knew my chances were really small. Mario and I and Angela, his partner, who also works for the same organization, we were sort of tromping around in the hills there and saw some posts that the bears had scratched, saw these apple trees, I saw lots of trail cam footage. Never saw a bear. I did see some bear poop, which was unbelievably exciting, knowing how rare these Moskin bears were. So we were hiking up this trail. These bears live in the forest. They live in Oak Beach Forest, and they eat the acorns. And actually that's what makes them a distinctive subspecies of brown bear, is they have a snout that is really well adapted to eating acorns, crunching these acorns. So we came upon this poop, and Mario said, oh look, you can see the remnants of the acorns in there, and this time of year there's berries, and the bears don't have very good digestion, and so you can see the berries right there, you really got the color of the berries, that's like when we see bear poop around here. So we're standing around in awe of this, and then Mario picks up 2 sticks, and he squats down and picks up the poop. So he brings it up to eye level for all of us. And I'm now feeling a little nervous because I'm not sure what is going to be asked of me next. But he brings it towards his face, and he takes a deep breath in and breathes out. and he smiles and he says, "He's like a fine wine." And what was just so delightful about that, and Mario was just a delightful guy anyway, but what was so delightful about it is he saw this poop, or the essence of this poop, as something culturally important to him. And we talked about this afterwards. We had a few phone calls after I got back. And he said, this is part of our region. Without this bear, we die as a culture. And you can imagine hearing that from indigenous people in this area, but that was the first time I'd heard that from a European in a country like Italy. Italy has 60 million people in less land than we have in Montana. And so it was just fascinating to see that cultural connection that Mario had there. So the bear is a case that's a couple of steps away from the whale. So the whale just kind of leave it alone and comes back. The bear, you have to be kind of involved in the educational side of it, but also involved literally in providing its food. And so that was a case where some intervention was necessary. This is a case where even more intervention was necessary. So these are northern spotted owls, and as you all probably know, northern spotted owls are really struggling. In the 90s, they were really struggling because of habitat problems and the timber wars. And if you can sort of remember what happened there, Bill Clinton and Al Gore came out and they kind of worked out some sort of compromise, and they protected some of the old growth habitat. And these spotted owls had a bit of a lifeline for a while, but then they started struggling for a different reason: barred owls. So barred owls were invading their territory. They hadn't been there before. Barred owls made it from the East Coast by hopscotching across habitat that humans were altering that was more favorable to them than what was there before. And so because of humans, barred owls made it into the spotted owl habitat, and they are hammering the spotted owls. They're bigger, they're more aggressive, they basically change the ecology. They're a very aggressive nocturnal predator of lots of things. The spotted owls focus on flying squirrels. The barred owls are eating amphibians, they're eating rodents, they're kind of eating everything there. And they're pushing the spotted owls out of the good habitat. So these spotted owls are circling the drain. What can you do about it? Well, there is one thing you can do about it. You can shoot barred owls. And so I went out on the landscape with someone who had the appropriate name of Melissa Hunt. And Melissa Hunt had spent 5 years out on the landscape shooting barred owls, basically. And running an experiment to see if you could make a difference to keep those spotted owls alive. And you can. It works. It's clear it works. You can shoot enough barred owls that the spotted owls, their populations, instead of plummeting, they stabilize, and then they slowly start to go up. But of course this is controversial, and it's another step on from pruning the apple trees so the bears have something to eat. I mean, you are literally walking the habitat of the spotted owls, killing the spotted owl's competitors. That's what you're doing to make it work. And so this poses questions for us about, well, how wild does your wildlife have to be in terms of how much you have to leave it alone for it to count as wildlife? I mean, if you are just propping it up artificially by walking the forest shooting its competitors, does that spotted owl still count as a wild owl of the Pacific Northwest? So I asked Melissa, I said, do you feel any sort of ethical compunction about this, any guilt about it? And she says, no. She's like, come to terms with it. She says, I know it is controversial. She says, some friends of mine and friends of friends come up to me and say, is it true you're a member of Al Qaeda? Kind of lame, right? But, they make it clear that it's controversial. But she says it's something we have to do if we want the spotted owls to survive. And I said, do you mind if I put in the book how many owls you killed? And she says, no. And she said it's at least 350. So this is one scientist out there who has killed 350 of these And the rub here is that you can't just kill the barred owls once and be done with it. Because barred owls are doing incredibly well. I think they're the second most popular species of owl in North America. And so these barred owls are going to keep pouring in. So if this is the way to save spotted owls, we have to do it in perpetuity. And so this, I think, is a really extreme case. And so across these animals, you get these poles of just leave them alone and they live, or we've got to be super involved to let them live. And I think, being an ethicist myself, this is like classic ethical territory. Like, what do we do here? It's complicated. There's no clear way ahead. And that's actually what I found here, is I wanted to find that there's one thing you do, or two things you do to help wildlife recover. But actually, no. I mean, there's millions of different things you have to do depending on context. And so this book changed me in the sense that I used to be kind of a purist, I think, about what wildlife had to be and what our involvement had to be and where humans had to stand in relation to wildlife, which was usually as far out of the picture as possible. But I came to realize that you have to be pragmatic and you have to compromise on some things if some of these species are going to survive. So those were some of the lessons from some of the species. I want to just get now into, for about 5 minutes, and then I'll read one more passage and then we can start having a conversation. I want to get into what I said earlier about that third reason, changing how we think about animals. The subtitle of the book, Wildlife Recoveries That Change How We Think About Animals. When an animal comes back, you get to think about it a different way. So these sea otters have come back. So sea otter populations, after hunting of sea otters, around about 1905, were down to 1,000 or so animals. A few in the Aleutians, a really weird remnant population off California, and a couple of other populations in Alaska, Prince William Sound, but basically 1,000 animals, when they should have been all the way from California, wrapping around that Pacific Rim, all the way across to Russia and Japan. But they're back. There's 125,000 of them now. And there's room, there's more habitat that can be explored by these sea otters. State of Oregon are going to do a reintroduction pretty soon. So they're back. And I put a sea otter here in a kelp forest because one of the ecological benefits of having sea otters is they keep your kelp forest intact. Or if there's no kelp forest there, they help your kelp forest come back. Is anyone familiar with the link here? What sea otters eat that helps your kelp forest come back? They eat urchin. It's sea urchins that are devastating to kelp forests. And where you've had a lot of sea urchins, you get an urchin barrens. They call it an urchin barrens. It's just rock, basically. And the odd shellfish, but really just none of this amazing kelp fronds, the dappled light, the sheltered habitat that kelp forests actually offer. Sea otters come back, kelp forest comes back. It is that simple. And when the kelp forest comes back, kelp grows super fast. It photosynthesizes and it sucks carbon out of the atmosphere. And so there are people looking at the numbers of how much sea otters are contributing to bringing carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, when these sea otters are being killed, of course, I mean, climate change wasn't even on the radar, and this is a complicated ecological engineer role that people weren't going to be understanding then. But sea otters are back and they're playing this role and they're sequestering carbon for us. So just hold that thought in your head and marry it with this thought. This is actually some work I've done since the book came out. This is a patch of American prairie land out east of us here. And here's a creek that used to be grazed by cattle, and the cattle have been taken off there for a little bit, but not for long enough for the creek to really come back. But I show you that picture first because I want to show you this picture, where cattle have been off the land long enough for the creek to really recover. And they're recovering with bison on the landscape. And the reason is the bison don't need to stand in the creek eating that vegetation. the bison like the uplands more. They like the heat. They like the grasses up there more. And so if you just trade cattle for bison, you get these creeks filling out like this and greening up. And here, we get a beaver dam on a creek that bison have greened up. And what's interesting about this, look at that beaver dam. It's rushes and mud. So these beavers are not like felling willows and aspens. They're making the best of what's there. And what's there is there because the bison are there. And then eventually, as this gets wetter and wetter, and it's still getting wetter and wetter, the cottonwoods will start to come back, the streamside vegetation will come back, more beavers will move in, and you'll get this habitat back. And this is a good thing on prairies that are facing the onslaught of climate change. So these thoughts about these animals that are helping us with climate change are thoughts that we might not have had a century ago. Well, we wouldn't have had a century ago. We wouldn't have sort of put those pieces together. But we can look at them differently now. And we can recognize that they're playing this role, which is an important role for them and for us. And then sometimes we take it a little further. We watch what beavers are doing, and we learn from them. So I went out into the lower national forest with a PhD student studying how the hydrology changes when beavers are on the landscape. So learning from these beavers. And then in places where you can't have beavers, you can pretend you got beavers by building a beaver dam analog. So that's what these folks are doing. There's no beaver in this creek, but they're building beaver dam analogs because they know they have learned from beavers and they know that this will help the creek health. So hold these thoughts in your head for a second. When you think about the carbon benefits of sea otters, when you think about the carbon benefits of bison, when you think about the expertise of beavers, we can have different kinds of attitudes. Attitudes of ally or partner, attitudes of apprenticeship to an expert. And these are attitudes that I would say are attitudes for today. And attitudes which, outside of indigenous cultures, because some of you might have been thinking, well, look, this idea of learning from our animal kin has been present for a long time in indigenous cultures. But it's showing up in Western scientific evaluations of these animals today. So I thought that was a really interesting thing to learn from animal recoveries. So I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to read one more passage and wrap up. But where I wanted to end with you here was to say, this book for me was about changing attitudes. And the attitude I really sort of consistently throughout the book that I wanted to change is I wanted to push on this idea of optimism. I wanted to push on this idea of possibility. I wanted to push on this idea of having a vision of what could happen if things go right. If we play it right, if we do the right things, if we give species space, if we give them that little glimmer of possibility, then they will step in and take that possibility. And so this is a picture of those of you from, well, a little west of here, the Loxaw Clearwater type of area. This is the Loxaw River. And I've been in Missoula 15, 16 years, and I sort of heard you used to be able to see salmon pretty close to Missoula, and I thought, that's not possible. I mean, it's just, there can't be salmon. I mean, certainly now there can't be salmon. So I did some poking around, and somebody said, I can tell you where you'll see salmon. And they pointed me to this spot, which is actually, it's above where the Loxaw, the two creeks that come together to become the Loxaw. And he said, go to this milepost, get out the car, walk this way, turn here, go there. The details will necessarily remain hidden. And he said, you'll see salmon. And so my wife and I went there, and we did exactly what he said. And he was exactly right. We saw Chinook salmon in this creek. These salmon were 600 miles from the Pacific Ocean. They were 4,500 feet above sea level. They had negotiated 8 massive dams on the Columbia and the Snake River. And they were back in their natal habitat, the place they were born. They were depositing eggs, and then they were going to die and gift their body to the forest. And so these salmon were emblems of tenacity, emblems of tenacious beasts, and examples of what could still happen if we play it right. So let me just read what I was thinking when I left those salmon behind. There was one more thought I had as I left the salmon that evening. There will come a day when Earth's human population will peak. It may be shortly after the middle of this century, it may be later. Up to that moment, Earth's biodiversity is grinding its way up a hill like an ancient roller coaster, slowing so much it looks like it may never make it to the top. Each loud clack is a doubt about what will be left behind. But when it does reach the crest, the long struggle against gravity will finally flip to become an accelerating free fall. Millions of bodies will slither, fly, and hop their way back onto soils and waters, released from service to human needs. Seeds will float in and take hold. Rhizomes will reach outward from their strongholds, and life-giving spores will alight on surfaces previously covered by crops and cement. There will be a joyous free-for-all as uncountable numbers of fins, hooves, paws, and carapaces rush onto newly liberated spaces. Recovering wildlife are the reservoirs that will fill out the green and blue spaces we cover on the map. The work we do now will be a bridge to a world we can only dream of. Trickles of possibility will become cascades of life as animals regain the room to flourish. And just as we did for thousands of years in the past, our species will start to remember an ancient wisdom born of entanglement with the lives of animals. We will find ourselves bending once again to the pull of biological forces that never fully went away. So, I hope I've given you a dose of optimism. If you want to talk about more of the particular cases, I'd love to do that, but rather than me go on for any much longer, I'd love to hear some of your questions and thoughts.
Two questions.
Yeah.
Humpback whales, what time period are we talking about from when they were minimized to where they come back to today?
Yeah, so in the 1960s, there was a moratorium on commercial harvest of humpback whales. In the 1980s, there was a global moratorium on all commercial whaling. So humpbacks had it from the 60s. Other whales have had it basically from the 80s. And humpbacks, I should say this so that biologist who's going to call me out on this doesn't call me out. Humpbacks are doing exceptionally well compared to some other species. So blue whales, for example, are still only at about 2% of their population. But I don't know if anyone caught the news story. I think it was just last week, actually. A new breeding ground for blue whales has been found in the Seychelles, and so there's some hope that even the blue whale population might start coming back up. But humpback whales have done exceptionally well in basically 50, 60 years.
And the other question was barred owls. So the lady that's been shooting them, is she doing that within like a certain radius of where she lives, or does she travel the country or her state or whatever?
So it was just an experiment that ran for 5 years, and it ended a year and a half ago. And they had test plots in Northern California, in Oregon, and in Washington. And so I was on the Wenatchee National Forest in Washington, and they just did it in these test plots. And when I checked in, so about 6 months after I was out on the forest, when I was getting my draft ready, I called in and I said, how's it going? What are you learning? Where are things at? And she said, it's so frustrating. Because she said, what we did was working, and the experiment's now over, and this has to go through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we have to come up with a policy now. And while we're coming up with a policy, these barred owls are pouring back in again. So I think it's a source of frustration.
Yeah, it's illegal to kill any raptors, so
Yeah.
she had to have special permits for that.
And Also, to be honest, it's not every owl specialist sees it the same way. I spoke to a guy who, his name was Tim Fox. I spoke to some people with some extraordinary names. One of the sea otter people was called Lauren Wild, and there was Melissa Hunt and Tim Fox. And so Tim had worked with spotted owls for 8 years, and he'd gone out there finding nest sites, and he demonstrated this perfect spotted owl call. And he would call out and wait for them to call back, because owls tend to be territorial, so they're sort of responding to calls. And when he heard an owl, he had a backpack full of white mice. And so when he knew he was close to an owl, he would put a white mouse usually on a fallen log, and then would back away fast. And the owl would see the mouse and would just come grab it and then fly it back up to a nest. And then Tim's job was to run after that owl as fast as possible to find the nest site. And if he did his job well, he could kind of be there just in time to see the owl disappear into the nest site. And if he wasn't sure what tree it was, if he knew he was kind of in the right area, but wasn't sure what tree it was, he'd get another mouse out of his backpack and he'd put it on the ground at the bottom of the tree that he thought was the tree the owl was in. And he said the owl, if it was the tree, the owl would step out of the tree and would hold its feathers, its wings out just a little bit, and would parachute down. And it would literally parachute onto the mouse and then grab it and fly back up into the tree. And I never thought or imagined that an owl could parachute. It wasn't flying, it was parachuting. And it would take the mouse back up the tree. So anyway, Tim had devoted his life to these owls, and I said, well, what do you think about shooting barred owls to save spotted owls? And he said, no, shouldn't happen. They were originally the same species, then they diverged, and for whatever reason, they're converging again now. So he says, I'm prepared to see the spotted owl go. So certainly this was not there is controversy even in the raptor-loving community about whether this is an appropriate thing to do or not.
And on that same subject, it seems a little like, and I don't know what's best for that, I'm not going to make a judgment on that, but it seems a little like we want to continue living our lives as we want to, but the problem is they're able to cross the country because we've developed it all the way across. We want to continue to live that way, so we shoot the owls and save the spotted owl instead of changing our behavior and giving more wild habitat across the country where it couldn't, say, cross so easily.
True. I mean, we should always look about, well, what can we do to relieve the pressure on this animal? But in the case of the barred owl, that ship has sailed. It's like there's no undoing of that. Those owls are here. We couldn't you couldn't remake the habitat, kill the barred owls, and you're good to go. So in a lot of these dilemmas, the ideal solution is no longer available. And that was a hard thing for me to accept, because I sort of had this idealistic conception of how things should be. So when the ideal solution is not available, what are you prepared to compromise? Another example I mentioned in the book is California condors that are clawing their way back very precariously, but there's 320 or so now living wild. But those condors have to be brought back into the lab. They have to be captured and brought back into the lab every couple of years to get the lead taken out of their blood. Because 50% of condor mortality is caused by lead poisoning. So, can we fix that? Maybe. Can we fix it quick enough? Not at the moment. It doesn't look like we're fixing it quick enough. I mean, it's actually a fairly simple solution. It's to get lead shot out of circulation.
Again, it's about changing our behavior.
Yeah. So, in that case, the solution is more visible than it is in the spotted owl, barred owl case. But it is, I mention it because it is heavily interventionist. These are not wild animals that can live independently at all. They're conservation reliant. That's the term of art, right? Conservation reliant. A species that requires our effort to stay alive. These are complicated ethical dilemmas, I think.
How did you find, or did you look at reproductive rates, and how that affected the resurgence of that specific animal? I have to go look now, but I thought that one of the problems with the owls was, and this is not true of the barred, like the barred lays 4 or 5 eggs, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true for the smaller owls. It's more like a clutch of 1 or 2. So I'm just kind of curious how that, if you looked at that at all.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. One of the reasons the barred owl has such an advantage is that it reproduces. I mean, they talk, so some of the folks who were out on the forest there shooting them said, you can show up at the bottom of a tree and you'll see 5 barred owls kind of lined up, the 2 adults and 3 young. And the spotted owls are not reproducing that rapidly, so that's why they're not doing so well. When you asked what did I look at reproductive rates, my mind immediately went to the first few conversations I had with wildlife biologists about what makes a beast tenacious. You know, what makes an animal able to come back so quickly, and there's a very sort of obvious biological answer. It's like a pair of answers. It reproduces quickly, and it's a generalist feeder. So, you know, if you're a generalist, you can deal with farms and cities and human garbage, so you have a better chance in a landscape that is occupied and increasingly occupied by humans. So that's true. But I think the cases, when you look at the cases of animals that are doing quite well, you find some examples that are a little counterintuitive. I mean, sperm whales, for example, are not generalists. You know, they eat squid, basically, and they don't reproduce rapidly either. And sperm whales are not doing as spectacularly as humpbacks, but they are coming back pretty well. They're close to 50% of their pre-exploitation population. Another example, which I didn't look into in depth, but it's worth mentioning, is wolverines in Finland. Their numbers have gone up, and this might be to do with the data getting better. But there's more than 10 times wolverines in Finland than there were 30 years ago. So this is strange too, because you know, we don't think of wolverine as you know, rapidly reproducing generalists. I don't think so. Yeah, I don't know. I think one of the interesting things about this book for me is, like, I did not come at it as a biologist. Right. I came at it as somebody with some scientific interests and some philosophical interests, and I just wanted to say, all right, what am I learning? What am I seeing? And where is the quirkiness happening here? And there's lots of it, for sure. Yeah.
Sorry, I came in a little late. I was just curious, do you have any ideas on how to get more people on the same page? You know, like, there's a lot of people out there that want, you know, this species to do better than the other ones, you know, vice versa. And it's like, I think that everybody is on the same page where it's like, nobody wants to see a species go extinct. But which species are more important than the other? And how do we get more people to, you know, kind of see, like, hey, what's the more common good, and where do we put, you know, the species on the food chain list? Do us as humans want to be at the top of the food chain, or do we want a certain other species to be at the top of the food chain? How do we kind of get more people to be on this, you know, in agreement that we need to have a balance of everything here? And for me personally, I think that humans should be at the top of the food chain. But, you know, it's like, which ones are where do we list everything else, you know, like, what's the most important?
Yeah, you know, one thing that is true about what I wrote is I tended to gravitate to the more charismatic species. You know, I've got bison in there, I've got wolves in there, I've got beavers and sea otters and whales. And some people have asked me about the book, where are the tenacious insects? You know, like there must be some tenacious insects, because actually, about reproducing quickly, I think it's just not the data on which insect species have crashed and then come back. But yeah, so the charismatic ones have an advantage for sure. And then the dangerous ones have a disadvantage for sure, right? Because we start to worry about grizzly bears, and people worry about wolves, perhaps excessively in both cases. But so you know, various species kind of come to this debate with advantages and disadvantages in terms of how people perceive them. One thing I do think is important, I can't remember if you caught this part, but we've got to have a 2023, soon to be 2024 conception of these animals and of their behaviors. And we've not got to have an 1890s conception of them. And so, for an example, we know how polarizing wolves are. And I understand the reasons why wolves are polarizing. I understand why, if you are a particular person on a particular ranch, the presence of wolves can be utterly devastating to you. That said, if you look at the numbers of cattle that wolves take in Montana per year, and this is State of Montana Bureau of Livestock numbers, it is 0.0016% of the cattle population in Montana. 0.0016. Now, compare that number to the amount of political space that wolves take up. It's a mismatch. It doesn't. The political space doesn't match the reality. So one of my goals here is to sort of try to gently make the case that we've got to get the reality about these animals right first. And then we can make decisions about how many we can live with and how many we can tolerate. And I think we've got a lot of road still to travel on getting that right, getting that social carrying capacity.
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much the cattle as it is, for folks that are from here, that participate in hunting activities, this and that. When it comes to mule deer, elk, and moose, those numbers, who spends the most time outside? There's plenty of biologists that, want to go out and look around and get numbers and stuff like that, but, I feel like hunters spend the most time outside for most of the year, and they've really seen, just how detrimental the wolves are to the, ungulate species out there. And so it's like, okay, are we going to put wolves above the elk, the deer, the moose? It's not so much the cattle, because we can manage, ranchers have found ways to manage to make sure that their cattle aren't being, wiped out by the wolves. And a wolf, long before we ever showed up, wolves have been trained to go after those kinds of species. And, if you read the Lewis and Clark diaries, when they came out here, long before the white man ever showed up, they almost starved to death going over across the Rocky Mountains because there wasn't any mule deer, any ungulates, food to really eat for them. So it was a very predator-rich environment. So it's trying to find that balance in there, but it's hard to get everybody on the same page with that. It's like nobody wants to kill every last wolf. Nobody wants to kill every last grizzly bear. It's managing them right, and I think that we should be focused on, hey, what's best for mankind, And yeah, we all like to enjoy the wildlife, this and that, but it's trying to find that management in there, and it's trying to get everybody on the same page with that.
Yeah, it's totally complicated.
It's very complicated.
One of the things, so I spoke to a lot of biologists in the course of this book, but so many times I heard from them, this is not actually a biological issue at this point. It's a people issue.
Yeah.
And that was such a sort of conversion sort of opinion from anybody who worked with these animals, is that it is a people issue. And so, my sort of modest plea would be, if it's a people issue, let's get the let's get people talking about the right facts, and let's get people on the same page, and let's get people sharing space. So there's some anecdotes in here about an organization in Germany. So when wolves weren't in Germany about 20 years ago, and they started coming back when it's kind of weird. It had a geopolitical element to it. So when the Iron Curtain fell, and when the Soviet bloc was not sort of massing troops alongside one side of the Iron Curtain, and NATO wasn't amassing troops on the other side, all these military bases kind of, after that ended, all these military bases emptied out, and wolves, which had always been to the east, started pouring into Germany. They bred better on military bases than they did in nature reserves, which is kind of crazy. But they did, and they were coming back. And when wolves started coming back into Germany, I chatted with a lady who started an organization called Wiki Wolves, and she put city folk on farms, pounding in fence posts with farmers to try and harden their landscape against wolves. And, obviously that it works. You can harden your landscape against wolves. But she said what was the most important part about the work was putting these city folks in the same space as the farmer for a day or a weekend, and just talking about stuff, and just finding that common ground. And so that work, that cultural work, that people-to-people work is super important. And then you want to have good facts along with it. And I think there's way more room for progress than we think on a lot of this stuff.
Just out of curiosity, and as you mentioned, as an ornithologist, I actually worked on the spotted owl, barred owl hybridization projects in Oregon and Washington. And I think it's interesting what you mentioned about, that sort of just happening. I also got to consult on an interesting paper about two bird species in Madagascar who their mitochondrial DNA is concentrating and changing into common nuclear DNA. So you have these two species of birds that, given human pressure, are actually turning into a reservoir superspecies. And that way the learning from both species won't be lost, hopefully over time, as being a reservoir of genetic superspecies. But I guess my question is, I also got lucky enough to see the last stress month bristle front in the wild before they disappeared.
So
but the stress month bristle front, it's a bird in Brazil that just went extinct. So it was, anyways. But so I guess my curiosity is, like, in the idea of Tenacious Beasts, you're advocating for certain species, I presume, but I like the idea of species that can bring themselves back, in a sense, with a little bit of cooperation from us, but not necessarily such a heavy-handedness. But I don't know if there's, I don't know how government agencies are reacting to that. I guess I've also been involved in, like, Southwest willow flycatcher surveys, which that's a subspecies of bird along the Colorado River that is a subspecies of a very common bird that's receiving tens of millions of dollars of government programming to survey. It's a subspecies of a bird that's prolific throughout the continent, but it's receiving an excessive amount of funding. Now, I like it because it helps out, like, the Bill Will and some amazing habitat. That kind of ties into the, the Bureau of Reclamation's mitigation kind of programs along the Colorado River, which is in vast need of great help due to human detriment and, a lot of water and other things happening to it. But I guess my question is, in this book and in your writing, which I appreciate very much, I don't know if like you feel, I mean, as an individual and through your research, this is a hard question, I realize, but are there sort of, along those philosophical lines, can you draw one out? Like, what species do you triage? I suppose. I mean, again, that's a very loaded question. It's a very difficult question. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, sure.
If that's okay.
It is a difficult question. It's interesting to note, as you noted there, that the Endangered Species Act kicks in at the species level and at the subspecies level. So that's a thing. I mean, that's kind of crazy, isn't it?
It's interesting.
That, like, we throw sort of the full weight of the federal government behind subspecies.
Yeah.
And then in these cases of hybridization, it makes the whole subspecies kind of thing get weirder because you got these subspecies hybridizing with each other. I had one chapter where I lent into this a little bit, and it's the bison chapter, and I addressed it a little bit in the question of bison that are showing cattle DNA. And this is an interesting question because bison should be pure, right? Yellowstone bison, the purest of the pure. Turns out, and since I wrote the book, these papers have come out suggesting that every plains bison in North America has cattle DNA in it. Even the Yellowstone ones, even the American prairie ones, even the ones Elk River National Park in Canada, even the bison range ones. So, what do? Do we throw up our hands and sort of say, oh, there's no more bison anymore? So I spoke to one of the American prairie folks, and he said, well, what do you mean, what do we do? We carry on doing exactly what we've been doing before, which is to try and create the healthiest bison herds we can with what we've got. And I think there are cases with species on a human-dominated planet where what we're going to have to deal with is not what we would want to deal with in an ideal world, but it's what we have to deal with. And so figuring out how to compromise and how to accept certain things is the way to go. And then just to finish up the thought on the bison, so the European bison, which is also coming back from very near extinction, it was down to, they basically captured bred from 12 European bison. Now they're at 7,500, so it's doing pretty well. European bison have auroch DNA in them. So aurochs are the ancestors of all cows. So this was a sort of eye-opening fact for me, in that Europeans got all this evidence protecting their bison, and their bison already have cow DNA in them, because that's how things worked out evolutionarily. Is aurochs bred with bison in Eurasia.
I mean, even before there was human influence.
Yeah, totally, yeah. Humans weren't even on the scene, and that was happening. And so, if plains bison have cattle DNA in them now, how upset about that should I be? When you look over Europe, you think, well, maybe I shouldn't be upset about that at all. I spoke to a geneticist at Texas A&M, and he says, you know why this shouldn't be a problem? Because bison shouldn't be in their own genus. So, he was sort of saying, I don't like that there's cattle DNA in all bison, but honestly, bison shouldn't be in their own genus anyway, so I'm not going to get that upset about it. So yeah, complicated stuff, for sure.
Seems very American to me to not be purebred, right? I have an ag background and a couple of degrees in agriculture. It was always interesting to me that we offer courses in agriculture for breeding and selection, but we don't do it for human beings. We don't worry about that, right? Is anyone here purebred? Who cares, right? We're Americans. So the bison have bovine genetics, DNA, whatever. Kind of whoop-de-doo, really. I'm with what the guy from the preserve said. It's like, okay, do the best we can with what we got. But if you play a game with me for a moment and remove all of humanity from North America, everything you would think would drift back to an equilibrium, right? Is that what the objective is, to help nature? So from that concept, how much manipulation do we try to implement? And back to some of the other questions that were said, what's the goal? Where are we headed? Like, what are we trying to do? That's my question.
Yeah. So one thing I thought of when you started talking there about you being American, I asked, so Terry Dahl is a Blackfeet artist who worked with the EME initiative, bringing bison back onto the Blackfeet reservation. And I said, Terry, what do you think about this whole genetic purity issue with bison. Like, do you care about the bison on the reservation here, if they're genetically pure or not? And she said, what do I think about it? It pisses me off. She said most of this comes from Western scientists who are obsessed with this idea of genetic purity. And she says, I don't care about that. And she says, I've had plenty of people talk to me as an indigenous person about my genetic purity. And, accusing me of not being genetically pure. And she says, we don't want to hear that. And so we need to get over this issue of genetic purity. The second thing I want to say there is so my day job is I am an environmental philosopher. So, I teach that at the university. So I'm paid to think about this stuff. And I'm paid to talk to students about this stuff. And these are not questions that I have good answers to, even though I've spent decades of my life thinking about them. And so, they are questions that people need to be talking to each other about in good faith. And saying, well, look, if we, what is the goal here? Is the goal to have as many species that are pure as possible? Or is the goal to have species that are functional in their ecology? Is the goal to have species that support human nature economies? These are all very different goals, and we're going to have very different policies depending on which goal we choose. And I don't think we do enough talking about goals. And as the planet fills up, and as the influence of climate change increases, we're going to have to talk more about goals to get on the same page. So I hope that's what happens. I hope those are the conversations that we can all get into.
At dinner, we talked briefly about we were talking about plants and stuff, and I asked the question, what is the definition of a weed? It's what somebody says it is, and for me, it's a plant that's a bully, right? And so it takes more than its share, right? And so in the animal world, if we as humans can slightly manipulate a space and allow a tenacious species to blossom once again, excellent. I think so. Sea otters are great. Sea otters don't taste good. They're the most amazing creature I've ever been around. That they live in the water their whole life, and they have dense hair, and they're just amazing creatures. And the list goes on and on of all the cool stuff. And I think it's great that we would create an environment by just slightly manipulating something that would allow that to blossom instead of to die. And I feel like maybe that is the pathway, instead of getting down rabbit holes of things that may be failing anyway.
I appreciate your optimism, and it makes sense to me why you're sharing that. I'm just curious about the last passage you read about peak human population, and I don't know where that is in the book, but it seems like you're being positive about humans learning to embrace the biodiversity that may increase at that point. I was wondering if that's your belief, and if so, what gives you that optimism, or whether you're being optimistic for the sake of
So I have some genuine optimism on that topic, and there's two strands to my optimism, two main strands. The two main strands are this: human population will peak at some point, and this is not my field, but there are people who study it, and essentially, as education goes up, and as income goes up, and as women's rights go up, birth rates decline. And so all of those changes are happening, and human population will peak at some point. So that's one strand of optimism. The date, which when I was putting the book together, the most settled upon date I could find was 2064. 2040. 20 years away, 40 years away, right? So that's one strand of optimism. The second main strand is, in that time, between now and when human population peaks, we are slowly figuring out to do things smarter, to do better with less, to generate energy in ways that are not so damaging, to produce food in more productive and more equitable ways. So you've got this one good curve, which is the human population curve, and you've got this other good curve, which is sort of the technology plus the way we use our land curve. And they're both heading in the right direction. And then when you look at some of these tenacious beasts and you see how they've come back already, we're just getting going. And we don't have to protect 100% of the landscape to have grizzly bears or to have wolves or to have whales. We just have to protect enough of it so they can do their thing. So I don't know if you caught recently, there's a lot of this 30 by 30 movement out there, protecting 30% of the landscape by 2030. And they recently, under a UN framework, agreed on that in the oceans. And the oceans are a very exciting place to think about recovery. Because obviously they're not as dominated by humans. And most marine life is incredibly productive. So salmon are great in this regard too. 7,000 eggs from a female Chinook salmon. 7,000 from one female Chinook. Go into the ocean, when you start talking about bass, we're talking about millions of eggs from one female. So if you protect 30% of the ocean, really protect it, there is this incredible potential for recovery. And in places where the protection has already happened, fishermen living outside those areas are finding their catches are going up dramatically in a matter of 2 years, or even 1 year sometimes. So I am optimistic, not just for the sake of being optimistic, because I want to call this an optimistic book. I think there's some really exciting possibilities out there and some curves that are heading in the right direction. So take it for real. Yeah.
What? Maybe one more? Yeah, one more question?
I'm relatively new to Montana. I'm sorry about my voice, but been here about 2 years, and the wolf controversy has caught my attention. I'm from Minnesota. When you look at the land mass of Montana, the land mass of Minnesota, Minnesota has about 10 wolves for every one in Montana. Population of Montana around 1 million people. Minnesota's about 5. So it's much more densely populated. Plus in Minnesota there's no wolves in the bottom 60% of the state. It's not near the controversy in Minnesota that is here. It's just kind of puzzled me.
I'm going to add a statistic to the one you just gave. So in Italy, so I mentioned the bears in Italy, but there's another story about the wolves in Italy. The Apennine wolf, Canis lupus italicus. So Italy, I mentioned, has 60 million people. It has 4/5 of the land area of Montana, and it has at least 3,000 wolves. And so in Montana we have about 1,000. With
Minnesota is around 10,000.
So yeah, I mean we're doing well. We're on a path here, but I think we do need to look honestly at ourselves in Montana and ask, okay, how tolerant have we proven ourselves to be of wolves? And I think those Minnesota numbers are very helpful and instructive. I think the Italy numbers are also helpful and instructive. Slightly different wolf in Italy. It's a little smaller. The pack size isn't so big. So it's not apples to apples. But yeah, there's stuff to learn by looking outside of our borders for sure.
Okay. Thank you.